Excite your crops with inputs from Excite Biotechnologies, a Canadian company providing made-in-Canada inoculants and biologicals. Since 2010, they've been helping farmers harness the power of the soil. Let us help you find the best solution and access nitrogen and phosphorus with Excite Bio's lineup of inoculants and ag biologicals. Reach us at 1-855-XITEBIO or at excitebio.ca.
Thank you to our show sponsors, the Canola School, Ruminating with RealAg, and MMP. With deep roots in agriculture, MMP's farm management consulting team helps farm businesses make confident decisions for long-term success. From strategic planning to operational growth, MMP advisors guide farms through challenges and opportunities. Connect with MMP today to build a stronger future. Learn more at mmp.ca. Hello all and welcome to the Agronomists. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith. I am a few minutes late, Pete. I apologize. But you know what? It's okay because some people are digging out from, like my colleague Byrne, who's in the chat, from 30, 60, 70 centimeters of snow over the past few days. For tonight's chat, one of our guests is actually running just a little bit behind because they were traveling today and travel is still a mess. Before, of course, we get to tonight's conversation, a quick reminder, if you do collect those CEU credits, head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists. Let us know you took in the show and we'll get you lined up for those. Great to see everybody joining us YouTube. A reminder, we're also on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, and of course, realagriculture.com/agronomists or /live. So many places to find the agronomists. All right, tonight's topic, one I'm super excited to delve into. We are going to talk about interpreting soil test results. So now is your chance. Get those questions, get those queries in early so that we can answer your questions throughout our conversation. Let's bring in at least one of our guests while we wait for a second. Although who knows? Maybe he got here. No? Okay, we're still waiting. He's somewhere clearing customs, and that's okay. But Jack Legg is here. Jack, how are you?
I'm well, Lyndsey. Thanks for the invite. Pleasure to be here, and it'll be good to share my perspective from the lab point of view on soil testing.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this is, and thanks for saying yes, because of course we do often look at it from, we have soil scientists that come on, we have agronomists that speak here, we have, researchers sharing things, but we don't always get necessarily to look from the lab perspective. So I'm excited to sort of unpack some of these things, what you see from your end. And that's maybe where I want to start is, maybe let the audience know sort of your experience in the testing side of things and delve into just what is a soil test and what it is not potentially.
Sure, I can elaborate on that. So my experience, I started out of university as a soil sampler back in the mid-90s when GPS was brand new. It was still essentially aircraft navigation at the time and DOS-based mapping programs, and we've come a long way since then. But over the years, I achieved my certified crop advisor status, became the staff agronomist at the lab, and I managed the lab business for some time. And now I'm in business development with the laboratory, and I still oversee all those soil tests. So most of the reports that go through the lab, I approve. I look at the data and validate it, and that gives me a bit of a unique perspective that I'm looking at tens of thousands of soil tests a year. So your question, what is a soil test? I think sometimes the word test conveys that it's a universal method that everybody uses and we're measuring an exact quantity. And that's not the case at all. Right. The trick with soil testing is because soils are different by region, depth, acidity, all these different things that influence the soil, even climatic conditions and everything else that goes into that soil, means that what we're trying to do is not measure the total amount, because there's hundreds to thousands of pounds of macronutrients in every acre, but the trick is to find a method to measure that small portion, a very small portion of soluble nutrient or plant available nutrient. And that's why there's different methods from one locale to the next. So Quebec, for example, uses the Mehlich 3 method, and Eastern Canada, the Maritimes, would as well. Here in Ontario, we're very calcareous. So is Manitoba, so we use the same methods under our accreditation system and MAFRE in Manitoba. And Western Canada tends to be calcareous and high pH as well, lots of bicarbonates. So we use the Olsen phosphorus, for example, instead of Mehlich in Quebec. And then I'm sure when Tryston gets on, he might talk about Bray phosphorus, because there's regions in the Midwest that would use that. So I think it's a good idea to elaborate on the test methodology so that folks understand that there is different tests depending where you're at.
Now, I think one of the things that comes up from that exact point is there's still, I think, at times a challenge in interpreting what a soil test tells you, and if potentially everything that you can test for is actually plant available. Like, is that the gold standard that we're trying to hit? And are we there?
Yeah, so to elaborate on that, Lyndsey, what we're measuring really isn't a quantity. Even though we're reporting in parts per million, or some folks would report in pounds per acre. So for example, 10 ppm phosphorus, which is about 20 pounds per acre, it doesn't really mean that there's 20 pounds in a bucket sitting there ready to be used. What the soil test is really doing is giving an indication of how well that soil can provide nutrient to the soil solution. Now that number itself is somewhat meaningless, because until we take that number and compare it to or calibrate it to field trials to see what the response is, we don't know whether a 10 is low or high until we see what crop response is to different rates of fertilizer. Now, where we have accredited programs and provincial recommendations, that work has occurred, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's exact for every farm. So it's also good for growers to try their own rates, go full rate, half rate, zero, to get a comparison on what the maximum economic yield is based on your different fertilizer rates on your farm, because agronomy is quite local.
Mm-hmm. Now, Pete, Wheat Pete, is in the comments, as per usual, and we appreciate it very much, because he would like further clarification as to why Quebec and the Maritimes look at aluminum for P tie-up. Why don't we in Ontario or other areas?
Sure, that's a good question, and it's partly due to their soil types. So Quebec and East they tend to be low pH. They're acidic soils. Aluminum does tie up phosphorus, but really it only does so at very low pH, so less than 5. And if you're at less than 5 pH anyways, then it's a good idea to add lime to increase your pH to make all your other nutrients more available. So those that do Mehlich testing, the extractant for aluminum is Mehlich, so it does make sense to look at aluminum in those cases. But really, and especially with the Olsen test, what we're doing is we're measuring the plant available portion. If it's tied up, it's tied up. It's not reflected in the test.
Okay, now there's also a question that comes up is, and maybe some people are trying to do a gotcha moment, but if I have 2 soil samples and I send them to 2 labs, should I get the same results back? Do I always get the same results back? What can I learn maybe about sending them to 2 different labs?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we do get that question on occasion. So I'll give you a lot of answers, actually. First of all, is that 2 different samples from the same sample? Are they actually the same? 2 handfuls out of the same bucket doesn't mean that the results will be the same necessarily. In fact, at the lab where we do proficiency tests and we move samples around to many labs, we dry them, we grind them almost to a powder, and then you can split that. There's a bit of a splitter instrument that makes sure that it's an exact split. So that's the first thing I would say. Secondarily, what is the difference? If you're looking at a 9 phosphorus versus an 11, it's really not that different. And hey, there's Tryston.
There we go.
Sorry, I'll carry on. Sorry.
Yeah, you carry on and then we'll bring Tryston. Yeah.
Perfect. So the difference might not be that variable, because really a 9, 11, it's a low test. And if it's low, it's low, which means it's responsive to add more. And then the other thing to keep in mind, like we touched on earlier, is maybe the methodology is different. So two different labs might be running completely different procedures. A bray, we often say a bray at 26 parts per million is equivalent to a 20 Olsen, but they're really not that, it's not that linear of a relationship to make those assessments. Sometimes we test the same soil twice, bray and Olsen, and they're the same. Sometimes, usually bray is higher, but often bray can be lower sometimes. So there's no way of calibrating one to the next.
All right. You are here. Do we have sound?
I can hear you guys. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes. All right.
Perfect.
Thank you for braving the cold and the snow and air travel right now and still saying yes to joining us here. So why don't you tell us a bit about your role with Mosaic and what it is you do before you come to Saskatchewan, of course.
Thank you, Lyndsey. Thanks, Jack, for having me. So, yes, I'm Tryston Beyrer. I'm an agronomist for Mosaic. I focus on our crop nutrition and our biosciences product. So, basically, what I entail is I cover, I hail from Wisconsin. So, don't hold that against me for being in the
Absolutely
southern
not.
part of some of you guys' listening area. But I farm from there, but then with my role within Mosaic, I have the opportunity to get out and do a lot of trainings with our customers, with retailers across the countryside. When I say across the country, historically it's been Western North America, from Texas all the way up into Canada, and that brings me up here again today. So travel was good. I'm looking forward
Good.
to being with my team, and I like kind of being able to have the opportunity to talk about crop nutrition, the importance of fertility, and kind of like being the liaison between what's happening deep in our product development type pipeline within Mosaic, but also what's happening in the field with our customers and growers.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, so thank you for that, and that is one of the things we definitely want to touch on is everyone's like, oh yes, of course we fertilize, yes, that's fine, okay, how much? But we have seen, and one of the key things that the two of you both sort of hit on in preparing for this whole show is actually taking a look at what our soil testing results, what our actual sort of field level nutrients are actually doing as on average or as a trend. And we've got some data from Yes Ontario, but even points much further with Tryston's data to look at some of that. And so maybe let's just start there, Tryston, with what are you seeing as far as trends? We can focus on whichever nutrients, but usually it's phosphorus and potassium, I think, that we talk about. Sort of overall, are we drawing down over time? Are we maintaining? Where are we at as far as the trend line anyway?
Excellent question. So it really varies a little bit depending on the provinces as well as what nutrient we're focused on. So if I speak to phosphorus specifically to start with, there's different labs like that of Jack's that have helped compile some of the data that goes into one of the surveys that the Fertilizer Institute puts out every 5 years. And we're actually due for another one in the next coming months, which will be exciting to see what that trend line has done versus has it changed, or has there been any improvements, or as we might call out, is there any concerns of some areas that are maybe progressively getting worse over time? So when we look at phosphorus specifically, on average across North America, about almost half of the soils have been coming back is considered deficient. And when I say deficient, a lot of times those deficiencies will vary depending on the individual states or provinces based on what their critical level is. And Jack just got done explaining that, whether it's Bray or Olsen, parts per million that we're looking at. But if I think the common theme is that if there's a deficiency identified, that's a known opportunity that we can correct deficiencies that are occurring, and those are scenarios that are likely limiting yield in some way, especially when commodity prices, crop prices are compressed. It's not something we want to leave yield on the table when every bushel counts.
Mm-hmm. Now, Jack, and actually, I think we've got some slides we can go to look at some of the data on this. So we have producer Chase tonight, which is very exciting. Producer Chase, can we go to Jack's slide 1, I believe? We're going to look at phosphorus and at potassium. Jack, walk me through this. What are we seeing? What is this trend?
Sure. So this is all of our data at our laboratory. So it's predominantly Ontario, but what we did was we pulled out the Ontario data every 7 years going back to 2003. So you can see each of these is a 7-year interval. What it is the percent of samples that are testing within a soil test range. So on the far left is less than 7 ppm. And you can see that the number or the percentage of samples testing low is increasing over time. On the far right, the percentage of samples testing high is decreasing. So that may be not a bad thing necessarily. And part of that would be less high phosphorus crops, tobacco, tomatoes,
Right.
things of that nature. But overall, with the critical value we would consider for Olsen around 20, you'd expect there to be a big bell-shaped curve in the middle here. And really what's happening is fertility is trending down. I didn't add it up and put it on the slide, but it's about 40% of all of our samples are currently testing less than critical. And I'd also point out that's just the samples that we're testing. The farms
Right.
that don't get sampled, the rented acres, things of that nature, where are they as far as phosphorus values?
Mhm.
So we can
Now,
skip to
yeah, I was going to
potassium
say
after.
let's look at K as well and see if it trends the same. So that's the next slide. Producer Chase, there we go. Okay, different.
Yeah.
Okay.
Still, we go back to 2003. We had no samples less than 45K. We like to see it over 120. That's quite a lot that are testing down less than 60 even. But again, it's almost 50% of all the samples coming through the lab in a given year are less than critical values. So that's a real opportunity for folks, because that means you're probably yield limiting.
Right.
When you're less than those critical values, you're not optimizing your yield.
So let's leave this up for just a minute. Tryston, I want to go to you on looking at, now this is for Ontario, but as you mentioned, these are trends that you're seeing, in many other areas. Perhaps the absolute numbers are different, but Jack hits on something here of, realistically, are we limiting yield potential at some of these levels? And the answer is likely yes. So what is your experience in sort of navigating some of where some of these soils end up as far as potassium and phosphorus and those critical levels?
Yeah, so a lot of times I rely heavily on what the local recommendations are for, that fertility critical level. So like for example, you're showing here potassium. Further east, some of the I've seen a lot of recommendations say you should have 150 ppm recommendation. But there's been some newer recommendations in certain geographies that have actually been elevating some of the critical levels. I'll give an example we can show here in a little bit where some data out west or University of Minnesota to the south, they've increased some of their critical values for their high demand crops up to 200 ppm. And I think it just supports a couple different things. When we have higher yielding crops that have higher nutrient demands, you have a limited area that those crops can exploit those nutrients. Basically, those that are coming from the roots. And with some of the management practices changes that we've had, I'll use an example of corn that might be more relevant out east to the southern area geography. But as planting populations have increased, we have a smaller root area, and that puts extra pressure and demand on making sure that we have adequate or sufficient soil fertility levels to raise not only that crop at adequate levels, but hopefully higher yielding or higher trendline crops with greater crop removal.
Jason Vogt out of Manitoba shares from AgWise Labs, South Central Manitoba, P residuals under 15 ppm are anywhere from 37 to 52% of samples, and lower. So realistic. So okay, I want to pause for a second though on this phosphorus question, because potassium I think is a bit of a different beast, especially as we go west, and it's maybe less of a concern, but in pockets is definitely a concern. But phosphorus is, of course, one of these ones that environmentally we don't want going here, there, and everywhere. And we don't want our levels to get too high because we don't necessarily want, it moving or moving with soil particles, etc. So Jack, from that perspective, like, do we just have a changing sort of idea of phosphorus, or as far as we don't want to over apply, or is it economics and it's, as you said, maybe we've got rented land, we've got other things that we want to do? What do you think's at play here when we talk about slowly drawing down these phosphorus numbers?
Yeah, so I mentioned when I started my career 3 decades ago, the average phosphorus back then was around 40 for Ontario
Mm,
soil samples. So we've really come down a lot. You're right. It is it's an environmental threat to pollute with phosphorus. I think that society at large and government often thinks that farmers are polluting with phosphorus, but the numbers are showing that really we're putting on less than we're taking out. So
mm,
I think there's a bit of an opportunity there. Now we obviously have to be responsible with additions. Broadcasting phosphorus before a rainstorm, that's not a good idea, obviously. So the 4R principles have to be at play. Anytime we can get that phosphorus below the soil, the better. Um, and I noticed the comment there from Manitoba as well. And I had the opportunity to be in a meeting with John Hurd several years ago now, but back then they were recognizing that because of their seed or the phosphorus placement with the planter, they were knowingly mining their soils because they couldn't put it on enough with the planter. But they also
right.
didn't want to broadcast because there's so much water in Manitoba, and they were afraid of any sort of um, phosphorus risk getting in the waterways.
Yeah. Tryston?
Yeah, I would echo those comments exactly. Basically, embracing the 4R practices are important. No farmer wants to apply fertilizer and have it leave their farm or operation. And usually, when we get the blame, say we use agriculture, it ends up from you see it from eutrophication or those algae blooms and other things. And there's two ingredients that come together there. Usually, it's nitrogen and phosphorus. But if managing nutrients is complex, there's been a fair number of studies that shows that it's not just uh, agriculture additions. It can be legacy nutrients. It can be natural reserve nutrients within the soil, uh, erosion, other practices that can lead to that. I do think that many growers are doing a fairly good job of managing these nutrients, and especially with me covering a wide range of geography. When I come to Canada specifically, they they take in good merit that they should apply their nutrients using 4R practices. You see a lot of banding of phosphorus, especially when they go further west through air seeders and things like that, trying to get into the soil instead of broadcast. You're doing spring applications right before the crop needs it. You're trying to match the crop rates where need be. Oftentimes, I think we can review that as our yields change and our yield goals and removal and things like that. So there's different things that relate to the 4Rs, right? Source, rate, time, and place that influence those nutrient dynamics.
Hmm. We
The
had a
other thing
guest
I'd
on.
say, just
Oh, sorry, go ahead,
just
Jack.
to
Yep.
finish up on that, is that it makes perfect logical sense that our yields are growing, more removal, so the numbers are coming down on soil test fertility. But it's also
Right.
a bit paradoxical. How are we getting bigger yields on lower fertility soils? And I think it's largely management, better seed varieties, seed treatments, fungicide, you name it. Bigger equipment plants more acres when soils are fit. We're not mudding in crops like we used to, even not that long ago. So, but on the other hand, it makes you wonder if fertility wasn't declining, where could yields be there?
Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent point. I want to leave it there for just a moment. We are going to go to our second read of the night and come back to our conversation and maybe talk about some of, we've got some great questions in here about maybe some of the other interactions that happen in the soil as well to tie up nutrients. So, Producer Chase, if you would, we'll go to our read. The Agronomist is brought to you by Ruminating with RealAg, MMP, and the Canola School. From pre-seeding seeder setup and checks to pest ID and advice on nutrient management decisions to tips on determining swath timing, RealAg's Canola School covers every facet of the canola growing season. The Canola School is made possible through a sponsorship by BASF Canada and Invigor Hybrid Canola. Learn more at canolaschool.com. All right. Now, we could do a whole show just on phosphorus, and we do sometimes, and probably just on potassium. And we do sometimes that as well, of course, but we've got other things to talk about. We've got micronutrients to talk about. And that's maybe one of the ones I did want to ask about because um, I do recognize that, in a year like this one where margins may be tight, micronutrients may fall down the priority list as far as if you've only got so many input dollars, where are you going to put them? At the same time, when we've got a deficiency of any nutrient, it's going to cost yield, and some of them are relatively easy maybe to meet with small amounts if you know they're there. So Tryston, maybe I'll go to you first on, and I think we've even got a slide on zinc as well, but what are some of the, sneakier of the soil nutrients that maybe are in tight supply that might also be costing yield?
Yeah, so when I look through different nutrients, a lot of times we focus on N, P, and K because they're macro and large, and the crops need a lot of nutrients, of a lot of quantities of those. And we'll skip over secondary nutrients for the time being, but the sneakier ones might be those that are in smaller quantity. Oftentimes we call them micronutrients or trace nutrients, and it's not that they're not any less important than those macronutrients. It's just that they're needed in smaller quantities, hence the term micros. So if you look at something like zinc, one of the reasons that it's really important for the crop is early germination. It helps with some seed energy. It has some very strong relationships with other nutrients like that of phosphorus. So we've oftentimes found that building the two nutrients together is really important, because if you get an imbalance of one nutrient, it can induce a deficiency of another. Just like that of phosphorus, being that zinc is fairly immobile in the soil, we can routinely soil test for it. It's probably one of the more, I'll say, consistent or reliable soil tests from a micronutrient standpoint that we have. And if you look at the soil test summaries across North America, there has been a fair amount of deficiency occurred. Probably about a third of the soils across the Canadian provinces are deficient in zinc. And I think it just speaks to like not just focusing all on one nutrient, if it's P or K, but taking advantage of some of those other soil test metrics that we have and other micronutrients that we can look at assessing to see if those are also deficient. One phrase that Mosaic likes to term is the term balanced crop nutrition. So it's not just applying one nutrient, we're applying nutrients in a balanced metric, making sure that multiple nutrients are addressed based on the crop uptake requirements or removal requirements.
Mm-hmm. Now, and producer Chase, I think it's slide 3 of Tryston's that is on zinc. I do want to put this up, and we'll go through it in a moment. But Jack, I wanted to go to you on, we do have a question as well, and Tryston sort of brings it up that, a soil test obviously is going to look at specific nutrients, and you can, certain tests are going to be for certain nutrients, etc. But we opened the show with talking about, what a soil test is. We don't necessarily always get the full report of like what else in the soil could be, let's say, tying something up, etc. So from your perspective, how do we sort of bridge that gap of the balance of what's in your soil and what may be interacting? You mentioned pH is one of them. What are some of those things that we really need to be watching for as far as other minerals maybe in the soil that could be causing issues?
Right. So a couple of things that I do, and I'll let Jack jump into this as well. But a couple of things that I think of is, aside from balance of the different nutrients you're testing for, you might be looking at overabundance of some nutrients, such as calcium. Calcium may tie up or bind some of these, but without going deep, maybe Jack, do you got a couple comments that you wanted to provide, thoughts you had along those lines?
Sure. Well, I'd say that there are definitely some relationships where nutrients can be antagonistic. Potassium and magnesium are two, for example, that if you have potassium that's very high and low magnesium, you could get a potassium-induced magnesium deficiency. The other one is phosphorus and zinc, for example. pH really is the major influence on how soluble nutrients are. And that's why here in Ontario, we might be a bit different than other locales. Our accredited test for zinc and for manganese is the index value. And what that does is it takes the extractable soil test value, but also runs it through an equation that includes pH. So kind of a general rule of thumb is if your index is 15 to 20, you're borderline. If you're less than 15, then chance of deficiency. And if you're greater than 20, it's to 25, it's kind of where you want to be. The other one with the zinc is it's fairly safe to apply, like 3 pounds in a planter is lots. Now I noticed that Pete asked about reliability of one test to the next, and really if it's an accredited test, that means it's found a certain R² that's acceptable for repeatability. But boron is one that we don't have an accredited test for. The standard extractant for that is hot water. And I don't think soil science has really found um, a tightly repeatable method for boron yet. But part of that is because we're testing so low. One is considered a high value, and 0.5 is considered, moderate to low. So very tight range. But I think that's one that we're maybe missing a bit out on as well. Corn and could probably do with a little boron, but I'm hesitant to say that because I don't want people putting on too much and causing toxicity issues.
Right. Now, Tryston, when I look at this as well, and Jeanette and Jason, who are in Manitoba, so in the prairie provinces there, that show up red on the zinc side, there is, of course, a difference between like a soil test level and whether or not you actually see a response to fertilizer additions, or whether or not you actually, of course, then you extrapolate from there, are you seeing a yield reduction? So from looking at this map and thinking about specifically zinc, is zinc one that, if you know it's deficient, you will see a yield response to added product?
Well, I'm an agronomist by nature, and I always say it comes back to it depends. And the reason I say it depends is
Always.
it depends a little bit on the severity or how deficient that nutrient is. So I'll give you an example. If you had zinc deficiency, let's say you were targeting 1 ppm, but it was zero point 0.7, it's deficient. But if you compare that to phosphorus, if you were targeting a 15 ppm Olsen, but you're down to 5 ppm or single digits, phosphorus is probably the more limiting nutrient of the two. And sometimes you don't get the full expression of the micronutrient deficiency until the phosphorus is corrected. I think there's also a couple comments in the in the chat saying that it also is a little bit dependent on crops. You look at some things like
Right.
corn or wheat, they may be a little bit more responsive than some of our legumes in aspect to zinc. So there is some hierarchy where there's some crops that are more favorable than others. I think at the end of the day, knowing that we're oftentimes growing multiple crops in a rotation, it's important just to address and be aware of are we one replacing crop nutrient removal of those micronutrients, even if it's not an annual basis, if it's sometimes applying zinc every few years to try to at least accomplish the removal rates, but then also that there might be one crop that might be more responsive than another. So making sure that we're not super deficient is important, and it all depends on grower risk and their perception of where they want their soil test values. And I'll give it an example. Is like if you have a long-term farmer that owns a majority of their ground, they may have a very low risk level where they'd prefer to say, hey, my ground's going to be passed on to my kids. I want to make sure that leave it in the best shape as I can. I want to try to address the fertility issues that I know of. Whereas you have those rented farms, they might be trying to manage it more on the margin razor edge for the profitability for standpoint, that saying that I may not fix all of my known agronomic deficiencies, nutrient deficiencies, but I'll address at least some of them to make sure I get my return back. And then the last thing I'd say is when it comes to micronutrients is that, while they are important, I have seen double-digit yield differences or advantages from those when you're in deficient situations. Our goal as producers, hopefully not to get to that level. You don't want to see
Right.
big yield bumps from a micronutrient addition because we know that that was super deficient.
Right.
And then when you get into single digit yield differences, those are more difficult to see with your eye, and you just gotta go a little bit with the basic fundamental understanding that understanding crop nutrient removal and uptake, and whether we're applying those nutrients at one point throughout the crop rotation.
Mm-hmm. Jason shares, higher phosphorus will tie up zinc, so I add more zinc if, let's say, I'm adding more phosphorus through manure. Jason also shared, he's in Manitoba. He shared some of the levels that he uses as those critical levels for zinc, depending on the crop, because as you mentioned, Tryston, there's certainly crop differences. Also, Wheat Pete would like you to avoid income tax by building soil tests. So there, good news for everybody if you're trying to sell fertilizer. Okay, but that is a question though. So let's back up a step, and Tryston, you pointed out a good example of, say, long-term management of land, and Jack, you mentioned maybe it's rental land versus and I think conceptually, we as agronomists, or we think about, or as farmers, we think about, you know, maintaining levels, drawing down levels, maybe if we've got a lot of, let's say, hog manure in rotation, or something like that. But there's also potentially the case for building levels of certain nutrients in certain years. But Jack, overall, we're not seeing that trend. Of course, we're seeing, we're drawing down over time. Where do we sort of land on sufficiency versus building versus drawing down? Like, how do you sort of talk that through on all those different options?
Yeah, you're right, Lyndsey. There's multiple philosophies when it comes to recommendations. There should be flexibility in recommendations as well, because it does depend on the situation. So if you're on a owned property and it's multi-generational, building fertility when fertilizer is deemed economic, it could be the best strategy for you. If you're on a farm that maybe in a year or two it's getting developed into houses, well, then building's not very economic. So that's where you want to do more of a sufficiency. The price of fertilizer versus the price of grains will factor into it as well, because at the end of the day, we want to have our not necessarily maximum yield, but optimum yield that is the most financially sound, giving you the most payback on your acres. But I also encourage people to not just look at the price of fertilizer, but understand the value. That if it's what you deem as expensive, but you're getting bushels out of it, then that could be good value, as opposed to cheap fertilizer that your soil test is so high it's not responsive. Then that's expensive because you're just throwing it away with no response.
Jack, I like this point of the relative value of something is not just the price you pay for it. It is the payback that comes from each added dollar, which is value versus price.
It's the return on investment, and I think that
Right. Yeah.
maybe if we've done something wrong over the years, it's that we don't factor in the return on investment. We do, as people in the rural countryside and farmers, we tend to look at price.
That's right. Tryston, you must have thoughts about this. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this, on the conversation of the value versus the price.
You're singing my language, both of you, because I know just recently, if you hear anything that comes from Mosaic, one of the things that we've been really preaching the last year or so is we call it ROFI, return on fertilizer investment, and understanding, where are those inputs most valuable. And we can look at, different soil test levels. Obviously, it's a great tool to identify where we're likely to see the best return. But then aside from there, there's ways to improve the efficiency of the fertilizer through the 4Rs, right placement. There's fertilizer additives that we can do to further, combine the fundamentals of balanced crop nutrition with biology to enhance the availability and, furthermore, increase the availability of those nutrients. So, when we look at trying to look at the value, like what's shown here on the slide, basically you can use as a soil test recommendations or threshold to say, what is your probability of response from a fertilizer? And the couple things I would note is there's no guarantee of a response. You could have
Right.
single digit levels of fertility, and based on the environmental conditions, we could have a great mineralization, this or that, and you may not see a big bump from the fertility that year. However, you are still fertilizing a soil, and that soil residual fertility can be there for years to come. On the opposite end of the spectrum, there's some scenarios like your very high soil tests that we wouldn't necessarily always expect to see a fertility response, but we do. And I always find that quite fascinating from a grower myself, or when I work with different retailers, different growers, is like what scenarios are we possibly going to see yield responses? And it can occur. You can have cool, wet soils, which we never see across your guys' area, right? That might be limiting nutrient availability to the crops. But even though the nutrients are there, they're just not positionally available or biologically available to the crops. And this graphic does another good aspect too. It just shows you where is that those nutrients come from to the plants. There is a component that's the fertilizer, and then there's another component that's the soil. And we got to remember that majority of the time our nutrients are coming from the soil that's providing the nutrition from the crops. But if your soil does not have the nutrition, or we're not replacing those nutrients, which comes from previous years of fertilizer applications or manure applications or things like that, then the plants don't have the opportunity to access those nutrients over time.
There's some great comments here in the chat about base saturation levels. We're not going there tonight. But that's unless one of my guests or both my guests really want to talk about it, but we don't need to right now. I do want to, producer Chase, let's go to, I want to switch it up a bit because we've got one last read to do for tonight, but I did pull a clip on proper soil testing procedures and some of the things not to do. Potentially. And so, producer Chase, if you would, let's go to our clip on soil testing procedures, and then we'll have our last read of the night.
A lot of conversations this winter about sulfur, the impact of getting the right rate of sulfur on soybeans. Horst Bonner, Sean Castile did a lot of work, a lot of conversations about it, and they talked about some of the work Mazix did last year. 27 bushels in a plot, just a stone's throw from here. Tell us about that, and tell us about what you're up to this year.
Yeah, Burn. So we had crazy good results. That was our second year doing trials. We had pretty good results, 15 something bushels the first year we went down the road. We got 27, really dialing in sulfur on soybeans. And we're finding these fields, in southern Ontario specifically, and we're expanding that region too, but where the lower CEC soils, they don't have enough sulfur, and they're really paying back big time on soybean yields. And we're seeing that here again this year. One of the most visual sites I've ever walked for sulfur.
Yeah, so you're going to get nodulation, you're going to get better nitrogen utilization, going to get bigger seeds, bigger yield.
That's right, Burn. We're going to see this all the way through every year. We see a little bit longer stay green. Maybe leaf drop is more uniform, not as long, but at the end of the day, harvest timing is about the same. But we got that little bit later stay green, just like we're looking for in corn, to maximize seed weight and maximize those yields.
So let's take a walk around this plot. We're seeing lots of evidence of that sulfur impact again this year.
Let's walk through it, Burn.
Okay, Henry, let's kick it off with a look at, I guess, the check here, your baseline. What do you got?
Yeah, Burn. So the trial consists of paired plots. So we have two varieties each time when we're looking at the treatments. And we have a control, a none. We have fungicide alone. We have AMS alone. We have a gypsum product called Sulfur Plus alone. We have AMS plus a fungicide. We got our fully loaded package that got us really excited last year. That's pure yield, slow release nitrogen. 100 pounds of it, plus 100 pounds of AMS and a fungicide. And this year, our last treatment is a 2x rate of AMS. So let's go take a look. So right here, we're looking at the control plots, Burn, and what we see, they're tough, they're thin, they're yellow. We're probably not getting much nodulation, and we're even maybe picking up a touch of SDS in a couple of the varieties already. So there's a cool interaction. Sulfur sometimes can help delay or even suppress how bad SDS is in the plant. It's kind of cool interaction. We'll see what some of the results from the US show as well, as they're doing some research on that too.
Our sponsors for the Agronomists are MMP, the Canola School, and Ruminating with RealAg. Ruminating with RealAg is a podcast series that focuses on all things bovine. We're here to chew the cud on everything from the latest in cattle genetics to how to keep your herd happy with rotational grazing to winter feeding techniques and everything in between. Find it on realagriculture.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, so that wasn't the clip, that was the other clip, but that's okay. We can also talk about sulfur on soybeans, or anything else we want to talk about as well. Although, I don't know if you guys are following along the comments. Do either of you feel strongly about the base saturation conversation and want to take a crack at it? Tryston, you look like you're smiling, so yes?
Sure, I can touch on it. So I
Sure.
love the conversation of base saturation. I'll say it's definitely controversial, depending on where you look at it from the science. My opinion, my philosophy, the way that I've looked at and utilized it is I always start with pounds per acre or ppm. That tells you the quantity of nutrients within your soil. That's the starting point that I use as a kind of good foundation of science. And I think that's pretty well grounded. There's not a lot of refuting ppm or pounds per acre. Now, to level set all of us for what base saturation is basically, no pun intended, it's looking at the percentage of a nutrient in relation to other cations, hence the percentage of bases compared to other cations. And a lot of times, as someone calls out, there's a lot of interest in base saturation around potassium. Now, I've heard the claims around 4% base saturation, some target levels or higher, and what that's looking at is trying to have a high enough percentage of your potassium in the soil compared to other nutrients. But it can be challenging when you have some nutrients like like calcium that can be really high on our high pH soils. So where I say is I will look at the base saturation, but be aware of what kind of soil conditions you're in. So if you're on a high pH soil, it may not be economically feasible to try to achieve a 4% base saturation. Even if it's ideal or agronomically correct, it's probably not economically feasible. That being said, is even though the ppm or pounds per acre says you're sufficient, doesn't mean that you're maybe won't see a potassium response, but I may not say I need a full crop removal or something to sustain the decay levels there. Maybe just a little bit. You could call it a starter or some other thing, maybe to supplement or complement what the soil is not able to achieve if you end up with a dry period or some other environmentally challenged condition for that. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, if you look at maybe coarse textured soil, something that's sandier, they just don't have the holding capacity, and the ppms or your pounds per acre won't be as high as what you get in the heavier textured soils. And you might find that while your ppm seems low, your base saturation might be sufficient. And in that case, it might be over 4%. You got to use a balancing act between your interpretations and don't get too much into one. Because base saturation is like a ratio, you could have a very small number of pounds of nutrients out there and have a correct base saturation. There's just not enough pounds of nutrients. So I use them both as tools in the toolbox. I lead with pounds per acre or ppm, but I use the base saturation as more of a secondary look just to see if things are in balance and if it's worth trying to adjust it. That's just my philosophy comments. Welcome, Jack, if you have any additional comments to provide there.
I think our thoughts are similar on that. So I won't repeat what you just said, Tryston, but yeah, especially here in Ontario and Western Canada, where we tend to have calcareous soils, high in calcium means the percent K is diluted. So you could very well have high testing ppm and potassium, but a low percentage. So building that over time might not give you the return on investment that we talked about earlier. The other reason I don't look at it is because you could have a satisfied ratio, 5% K, 10% mag, 65 calcium, but everything's at deficient levels. So how's that any good? And on the other end of the scale, like I mentioned, trying to build K to get a high enough percentage when calcium's already high is hard to do. Maybe I'll use a silly non-ag analogy that if the recommendation is a glass of orange juice to get your vitamin C so you're not deficient, you can drink 3 glasses, but it's more than you need. And at the price of orange juice these days, I'm not sure why you would.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I do like orange juice. I don't need 3 glasses. So there you go. Okay. Thank you both. Those are excellent answers. Well balanced. I like it. Okay. I want to, producer Chase, if you could, let's go to, I think it's slide 3 of Jack's, because I want to go through a few examples of where, because there's also a question about, do we use as much of the fertilizer that we add as we think we do? I think that is a decent conversation to have. But I want to take it from a bit of a different angle. And Jack, you've got some examples here that sometimes the solution is not just adding more nutrients. We've got to deal with something else, or we are managing for something else that just more nutrients won't necessarily fix, or at least not economically. So walk us through, we can go through this example or another one and sort of how that conversation comes together.
Well, these are pretty easy because I didn't want to go through it nutrient by nutrient. But what I thought I'd do is put together a few real case examples of where somebody wasn't soil testing and then they finally did and they came to some realizations on what was going on. So in this case, you see some fairly high numbers on P and K. This is where there's a trouble spot or it's not growing well and fertilizer keeps going on to increase yield and it never happens. Well, the soil test shows that pH is 5.2. So in this case, the yield was all based on the pH, and efficients aren't very or nutrients aren't very efficient at low pH. Right. So in this case, because K is higher than mag, we do look at that K to mag ratio. I think dolomitic lime in this would turn it right around.
Okay.
I think there's another example there. Yeah.
Yep. I think it's, there we go.
Okay, so this is an example where the crop is pale, yields are declining, but there's high fertility. So this is one of those head scratchers where you say, well, what's going on if you just look at the soil test numbers? But it turns out it's a livestock operation, all kinds of manure, hence the 4.5 organic matter and the high P and K, and zinc's fairly high too. This is more physical or structural, compaction issues, poor seed bed, poor emergence. Or if you didn't expect such high results based on your history, then maybe there was manure applied and then the sample was taken, and the sample's been biased with manure. But in most cases like this, it's compaction that's causing some problems with growth, not fertility.
Mm-hmm. And I think we have one more. There you go. Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So I think I even saw this in the comments earlier, where this is, continuous soybeans. There's still that perception out there that soybeans don't need nutrient. And it's true that, a lot of the field trials show that they don't respond well to nutrient, but they certainly use a lot. There's a lot of uptake. And, over my career, we've gone from 40 bushels of beans to, boy, some people are pushing 70. So you're almost doubling the removal. So this is a case where continuous soybeans, organic matter is low because there's not much organic matter going back on. P and K have been dropping over the years with every harvest, and this is the grower that just thought they're easy. They don't need nutrient. Well, right. He should have been fertilizing all along. And then, of course, another thing that we should look for in poor yielding soybeans is soybean cyst nematode. That's been a fairly regional problem, but I think it's around in a lot more places than people know.
And yes, and this is one of those ones that is a topic we need to do on the show soon, because it seems to this winter have been popping up more times than maybe we'd like, and deserves some attention. Okay, Tryston, in looking at some of these as well, so these are just examples and some quick examples of where there's so much more, of course, than just nutrient analysis. There's other things that happen. But in looking back at sulfur on soybeans, etc., when you're trying to diagnose some of these issues, what are some of those trickier parts where you're trying to really identify what's going on? Is it a balance thing? Is it that you're is it compaction that's maybe sneaking in there? What are some of the tricky things that you try to get around when we're talking nutrient management?
Well, that's where a good agronomist comes in hand, and hopefully they can help distinguish that. Because I have seen too where you can get good soil sample numbers, you can have good plant tissue numbers, but you find out that what's the limiting factor. Obviously, a crop could look poor. It could come back to compaction. We start with fundamentals. If you want to maximize your fertilizer efficiency, target and try to correct pH, especially if it's low. It's a little more difficult to change if it's high pH, but if you're low pH, get some sort of lime out there. You can increase your fertilizer efficiency from 20 to 40% just by correcting your pH into a more desirable level for the crops. But get your hands dirty. Look for the compaction. You might find that you have high water table. Sometimes I've seen just a lack of good drainage can limit the efficiency of our roots to go down and find the nutrients and be able to be prolific there. So
mm-hmm. Now, okay, so earlier, I'm trying to find it in the chat and I can't find it, but Pete made some sweeping claim, but I think it's worth mentioning here. There obviously is an efficiency factor of every pound of nutrient we add to the soil. And we know that some nutrients are more prone to losses, some different losses, and that obviously there isn't 100% efficiency on everything we add. Tryston, maybe I'll start with you though. Are we doing better at better matching the nutrients added to what the crop actually can access and uptake and managing better, or where are we maybe still falling flat on some of those efficiency factors?
So there's a few things I'll comment on here. Number one is when you look at the efficiency of different fertilizers, or different nutrients, know that there's several different things that impacted it. Someone made in a comment that there was someone that claimed that 30% efficiency or 70% of the nutrients was lost for nitrogen. That would be what I would consider probably on the lower side or of an efficiency or from a nitrogen perspective. Usually I say it's 40 to 60%. But even when you look at a efficiency of a nutrient, question that we oftentimes ask is, what has happened to that other nutrients? It's not always that it's necessarily lost. It might be getting tied up into other pools that we're necessarily not measuring. For example, could that nitrogen be going in organic form or some other form of nutrients and stuff out there? The other aspect that I would mention would be that of just understanding that, are we fertilizing for the nutrient requirements for the crops? And many times what we thought was acceptable may be inefficient or not meeting our crop demands throughout there. If you're doing the same thing over and over again, your yields are continuing to improve, we may be coming with shortcomings on our fertility matching our crop nutrient requirements.
Now, there's great question here from Jeanette Gauthier out of Manitoba, a diagnosis question. So Jack, I'll go to you on this one first. Do you take a soil sample every time you submit a tissue test based on an issue? Not regular, like say with potatoes, but spuds, which is a great word. But Jack, when, let's say an agronomist is using something like a tissue test to try and diagnose something, should you always be taking a soil sample? And if so, are there any tips on what sort of depth and what you want to actually be taking at that time?
Well, to quote Tryston, it depends. And I do know what a spud is, but I love PEI, and out there it's a bodata. So
A bodata, yes.
a bodata.
Mm-hmm.
So the soil nutrients don't change that dramatically over time. So a soil test every 2 or 3 years on a sandy soil is likely adequate. But it's a good question because the soil test is telling you how much nutrient is there available for the crop. It doesn't predict how well that nutrient will be utilized by the crop. And there's so many things that can impact that. Obviously, weather, moisture, pH. The tissue test is a very accurate, because it's a total measurement as opposed to the extractable like in a soil. It's a very accurate measurement on how much nutrient is in the plant. So doing the comparison between the two often is very straightforward. You see low in a nutrient and it's low in the plant. But other times it leaves you scratching your head a bit because it could be high in the soil, but low in the plant because something else is causing antagonism or some sort of environmental condition or physiological thing in the plant is keeping it from being utilized. So I don't think you need to match a tissue test with the soil every time, but if it's a really problematic area, then perhaps doing that diagnostic would be a good solution. And I'd also say with the sandy soils that potatoes are usually grown in, you can pull those nutrients down more quickly. So maybe a 2-year rotation on sampling instead of every 3 years.
Mm-hmm. And Tryston, that was going to sort of where I go with that. I should have, but what if I don't have a relatively recent soil test? Would that be a reason to then do it? And if so, what is considered relatively recent?
When I look at soil tests, I'd say I want them for sure within the last 4 years. There's some that are being more progressive and doing it every year or every other year. Like I said, you may not have to be that frequent, but it depends on how quickly you're maybe trying to change some of your soil fertility levels and if you want to see some of those changes. And also realizing that, even if you're doing something like lime, you don't need a sample immediately the next year because it takes a little bit of time for some of those things to react. So I use that as a benchmark. If for whatever reason you don't have a soil sample, say you got a new piece of ground and you got it right ahead of spring and you need to go. I would recommend soil sampling as soon as you can. However, you might find that I'm going to have to just go off of my known nutrient uptake or removal coefficients to try to determine how much does my crop need for nutrients and use that as a benchmark, and use your idea that, how much do I need to just maintain the crop productivity out there, or maybe if it was a neighboring field and you say that's never looked great, you might kind of instinctively know, like, I need to put a little bit more fertility into it. So use those book values. There's a number of them out there to understand what crop nutrient removal is, and make sure that you're addressing those fertility needs from a P, mostly specifically for like a phosphorus standpoint, that we know that those nutrient levels are already challenged or in our across our provinces. But don't let equipment limitations hold back what that right rate should be. This one, probably one of the most common challenges that I see out there is we say we want to apply X pounds of product, let's say it's 100 pounds of product, but that may not be meeting our full crop demands and needs. And while it may be close, when you do that for 5 years or 10 years, all of a sudden you realize you're a couple crops behind on the amount of nutrients you need, and that's what's consequently affecting the soil test values.
Really good point is that definitely, I think in any of the conversations that we have on nutrients is exactly that. Have you solved the limitations of how you're going to get that much product on? And so that is sometimes why we have to go different times of year potentially for different nutrients, etc. Okay, Mark's got a good question, and Jack, I'll go to you on this one because you did mention on one of your tests that maybe there was a manure contamination part of that. So Mark soil tests after wheat. So it's it says we test all the ground every third year after wheat. So he goes in after wheat and tests, but it's before he adds manure and does disc ripping and a cover crop. Should he be sampling after the manure and the disc ripping versus before, or is he doing it correct in your mind, Jack? Oh, are you muted? We lost your sound. Hang on. There we go.
There you go. I wouldn't say he's incorrect doing it the way he's doing now, because we definitely don't want any manure to bias that sample. And if you're paying for a soil test, you want to make sure that it's the soil you're testing and not the manure. So usually we recommend 6 to 8 weeks after application if you wanted to test the soil after manure goes on. But doing it beforehand and also testing your manure and accounting for the nutrients going on is important as well. And we were talking about efficiencies earlier too. So with phosphorus, you're only counting on 40% of the total there to be available for the next crop. And potassium, it's a little higher, it's about 90%. But I also encourage people to do manure testing because we have good average values, but they're just an average. We know what Wheat Pete says about averages.
That's
and the storage, whether the bedding, the feed rations, everything can influence that manure. So where you might be expecting, an example I use, you might be expecting 5 pounds of phosphorus per ton. You could get as little as less than a pound, or you might get as much as 20. So that's a big range over an application of manure. So it's always good to test your manure so you know what's going on. You can account for it after the soil test, and then just keep up the routine soil test, and it'll probably show long term.
Okay, we are out of time. We have to leave it there. This has gone very quickly. Tryston, thank you for joining us from an airport somewhere in Saskatchewan. There's only 2, so I mean that narrows it down. But I really do appreciate it, and I hope the weather warms up while you're there because it has been just rude, to be honest. But thank you so much, of course. And for those who are looking for maybe more on this topic, Tryston has joined us on some Soil School episodes as well on realagriculture.com. So go check those out. And Jack, thank you so much for saying yes and for sharing your expertise and your time with us. I really appreciate it. And maybe at some point we'll have a test for sulfur, but apparently we're not there yet. So we'll keep working. Pretty close. We'll keep working on that one. Okay. Thank you, of course, to everyone in the comments as well. Thank you for making this show a part of your Monday night. Next week, we're going to talk about not just forages, but annual cereal crops and what they can all do or not do, potentially. Yes. check it out. We'll see you right here, 8 p.m. Eastern. Make sure you head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomist and get those CEU credits as well. And while you're there, sign up for our newsletter. Have a great night. Cheers, everybody.